In this video, we're going to be exploring how to make comparison charts in Tableau. So remember, the purpose of these comparison charts is to make it easy for the viewer to compare data either across time or between categories. So things like line charts or various flavors of bar charts. So we're going to be working with the world indicators dataset like we had before, and we'll make one of each one of these flavors and show kind of how Tableau gives us hooks into changing some of the important parameters of these figures to kind of make them more readable in certain situations. So let's start with just kind of a vanilla line plot rather, and we'll do the same one that was in the slides. So if you remember, that one it was a time series plot, and so by convention, time series plots always have time along the horizontal axis and the variables interest along the vertical axis. And so we'll drag years into columns. Remember, columns here is the horizontal thing. So you think about the individual columns being the position along the horizontal axis. And then we'll drag CO2 emissions from the area over here onto our rows shelf. So notice that we just have a simple line plot. The tooltip automatically updates so that we have the year, the X position, and the CO2 emissions, the Y position in the tooltip itself, so users can make quantitative as well as qualitative comparisons. So this is nice and it is helpful, but we can add a little bit of spice here by breaking down emissions according to region by then dragging a region onto, and you can do two things. So let's do them both ways actually. You can do it by detail. That gives us one trace per region. So we've broken the detailed view now is by region. But notice that this is not super helpful in the sense that it's not possible for us to really see which region is which. So in fact, it's probably better to delete this, and we don't even actually have to do this, but it's good to show how to delete stuff. We'll remove this and instead drag region onto color. So this is quite useful in the sense that we now see that Asia's CO2 emissions are growing quite rapidly, whereas something like Europe, for instance, is flat and, if anything, declining a bit. Now this is not per capita. That you could say that this is potentially misleading, and we would have to kind of button this up a bit more. We don't have the tools to do that yet, but we will. I want to point out one other thing here, that you might be tempted to do country region onto detail. So now we have one trace per country, and the traces are color coded according to region. I would argue that this is not super useful in the following sense. Even though we do, yes, have one per country, I can't actually tell what most countries are doing because there's too many of them. It does highlight the kind of relative influence of China and the United States on these two traces up here, but everything else gets bunched together. So you kind of have to, and we'll talk about this much more as the semester goes on, choose carefully what level of detail you present the visualization at. Are we going to present it at the region level of detail or at the country level of detail? And oftentimes that's both a mathematical choice and kind of an aesthetic choice. So here we're just going to leave it at region. So let's make our bar charts. So remember, a bar chart is a comparison of a numeric value between categories of a categorical variable. So we have to have what's our category and what's our numeric variable. So for instance, let's do region, and we're just going to drag region to columns. So notice here we have our individual regions, and it's basically these ABCs here are basically blanks. It's saying, okay, well, what do you want to put there? So we're going to say country region into the rows like this, and now we kind of have a table. And so notice it's saying Afghanistan is in Asia, Albania is in Europe, Algeria is in Africa, and so on. But this isn't a visualization. We don't actually want to do this. So this brings us into a really important menu or submenu within each one of our variables that allows us to tweak how Tableau thinks about the variable, changing it from, for instance, a dimension to a measure, or a measure that's aggregated by sum to a measure that's aggregated by average, or we'll talk much more about that in kind of nauseating detail. But for now, we're going to go just click the little triangle here if you hover over, and we're going to say, down here, it's currently thinking of it as a dimension, which remember is a categorical variable. But imagine I just wanted to think about this as like the count of countries and regions. To do this, I would say measure, count, distinct. So what this is saying is I know that country region right now is a categorical variable, but I'm asking you, rather than to think about the individual categories, to just count the number of categories within each region. And so if I do this, I automatically get a bar chart. Notice that this vertical axis now is count D, CNTD. This is the count of distinct numbers of countries within each region. And so we have a kind of a standardized bar chart. If we wanted to instead show this as percentage of total, like what percentage of countries in the world reside in Africa or are located in Africa, we again go to that same menu where we say quick table calculation. There are bunches of these, and we're going to be going through many of them over the course of the semester. But it's basically saying if I don't actually want to show the variable itself, I want to show a calculation related to that variable. How do I actually do that? Well, here's our menu. So instead of showing the actual variable itself, I want to show percentage of total. So notice that nothing's changed. I'm just going to go back and forth here for a moment. Nothing's changed with respect to the height of the bars. The only thing that's changed is how the axis is coded. So in the count distinct, it's coded as actual count. In the quick table calculation, it's coded as percentage of the total. So this is saying that about 25.6% of all the countries in the world are located in Africa, whereas only 6.28% of all the countries in the world are located in the Middle East. Again, if your point is to show something more along the lines of composition of the whole, then we probably should present things in percent. If your goal is to show instead the absolute magnitude of these things, then you want to show the actual counts themselves. It's completely up to you. The last thing I'll say is that, remember, if our goal is to show lookup, like to aid the user in looking up individual values, then these categories should be sorted alphabetically. But if instead we want to show these things in a way that highlights the biggest ones or the smallest ones, we need to sort these things. So how do we actually do that? Well, there are a couple different ways to do this. And it's like, if we're looking for this sort functionality, it's like, okay, where would that live? So we want to sort this axis. So you might think it's going to live here, meaning we want to sort by this axis, but that's not quite working, is it? We want to sort by something else. So let's say sort like this. And we don't want the data source order. We want to sort by a field, and that field is country region. And we want to do this by, you could do it ascending or descending, but here let's do descending. So notice that I have some choices here. I could do data source order, I could do alphabetic, the actual, the alphabetical order of this thing, or I could sort by a particular field, and we'll talk more about some of the other ones like these nested, like sort first by this and then by this. But we're just going to sort by country, this count distinct, and off we go. So again, this sorting thing here is to show, for instance, that there's a drastic drop off between Asia and Oceania. That would be the kind of thing that's very visible from this type of plot where things have been sorted, but not otherwise apparent. So the last thing we'll do here is to think about this as a circle chart instead of a bar chart. And the reason for this is that, remember, according to Cleveland and McGill and other research, this line, to showing this dimension as length is not optimal. It would be better to show it as position. Now, the easiest way to do this is just to go here to marks and say circle instead. Pretty easy. So instead of, you can say, bar, which was what we had, we just say circle, and we just have now these positions. This is particularly useful or particularly common in data analytics or data visualization when we have a horizontal bar chart. So let's make one of those. It's very common to see these circles in that format, and much more common if you have the vertical orientation to just have the bars. So let's make a horizontal bar chart. So remember, we want to have a horizontal bar chart when we have many of these categories, or where the category names are longer, and so we want the text to be oriented in a way that makes it easier for the viewer to actually read. So for instance, if I want to have country region, I'll put that as my rows. So notice that some of these, like Bosnia and Herzegovina, like this is quite a bit longer, and to have this vertically oriented where the user's turning their neck could be unfortunate. So what do we want to do here? We're going to do the same type of thing. We're going to say female life expectancy, for instance, and we'll drag this to columns. So here we have bars, and that's totally fine. Let's just, for the fun of it, change it to circle, like we did a moment ago. That sounds great. Now, the problem here that we have currently is that these numbers don't make any sense. So this life expectancy here is a little strange, right? Like no country has life expectancy of 600. It just doesn't, it's not right. the question is what's going on, and it turns out that this sum here is really important. We're going to spend a whole week of the course talking about these aggregation functions, but for right now, let me just explain it quickly. What's happening here is this 764 in Afghanistan represents the sum of all the life expectancies in the data set associated with Afghanistan. Now, the issue is that there are multiple years in this data set. So if the life expectancy was 70, 70, 70, 70, 70, for instance, the sum of those would be 350. And so in this case, we don't want the sum, we want the average. And to change it, to change the aggregation from sum to average, we use that same menu that we did earlier. So we right-click, we say measure, and average. Now notice that nothing's really changed here in terms of the relative position of these dots. The only thing that's changed is the axis makes more sense. That's because if they all have the same number of years, they're all getting divided by, let's say there's 10 years of data in the data set, they're all getting divided by 10, and this, so relative to one another, the position stays the same, but the values are meaningful now. So we have our individual things. Now again, if our point was to show the data in a way that aids lookups, then we're in one situation. If our goal was to show things in a way that emphasizes the top of the life expectancy scale or the bottom of the life expectancy scale, then we need to do something different. Now, earlier we said we could go here and say sort, and then sort by. Let's do it slightly differently. In this case, this little dot right here, this little symbol right here, is actually our sort icon, and so you can sort it just that easily. So this immediately identifies that Japan, Hong Kong, San Marino, France, these are our top, and you can just kind of scroll all the way down and notice that we have some weird tail behavior here. There's some outliers at the bottom. Now you can even say, for instance, to kind of spice this thing up, you might want to say, okay, I'm going to make the region the color of the dot, and now you can kind of visually see orange is Asia, red is Europe, and it kind of adds a dimensionality to the data frame and kind of weaves a different piece into the story. So again, it's a question of how much you want to do. Like what threads do you want to bring into the conversation, and that is ultimately tied back to that business question that you're asking, or your kind of subject domain question. So there's no right or wrong answer about which variables to bring in, but they do have to be tied to the individual question that you're asking. So you could say, well, should I bring in GDP for the size, for instance, or should I bring in healthcare expenditures as a percentage of GDP, or the population as size, or something like this? All of these could be good choices in different arenas. So it's a matter of what story are you trying to tell, and what data have something to bring to bear on that question. So as we go forward, we'll practice all of these things and kind of fine-tuning these visualizations, but these comparison charts are a great place to start in telling our basic stories.